On July 10, 2026, a young princess stood in uniform at the Air Academy in San Javier. The cameras saw discipline. The palace saw something more useful, a future. There was a decree read aloud, officers waiting in formation, her family watching from the official seats. And then the king stepped forward and placed a military cross on his daughter's chest. A clean image. A careful image. The kind of image a monarchy keeps for years. Because it does a great deal of work without raising its voice. My dear friend, I have learned to distrust ceremonies that look too complete. A medal is never only a medal inside a palace. A uniform is never only cloth. And a young heir, placed in front of a nation at exactly the right moment, is rarely standing there by accident. Because this story is not simply about Leonor. It is about what crowns do when they need the future to look obedient, steady, and spotless. And before we finish, I want you to notice something uncomfortable. Spain did not invent this method. It inherited it. Long before this princess wore a military uniform, other women were trained, watched, painted, married, isolated, praised, and polished until they could carry a throne on their shoulders. Some survived it. Some used it. Some were almost erased by it. But every one of them teaches us the same quiet lesson. A palace does not wait for a future queen to become useful. It starts building her early, very early. If you wish to keep opening these files with me, stay close, my dear friend. I am Elijah, and in this house we do not polish crowns just to admire them. We turn them over. We look for the marks underneath. So if you value stories where power is treated with care, suspicion, and a little candlelight, subscribe to The Royal Keeper. Leave a mark on this episode as well. It helps this file reach the next person standing outside the palace door. Now, let us go back to the beginning of this construction. Before the medal. Before the uniform. Before the young heir became a symbol. That is where this file begins. Not with the medal, although the medal will matter. Not with the uniform, although the uniform will do a great deal of speaking for her. It begins with a question every palace tries to answer before the public even knows it is being asked. How do you make a nation believe in the next crown? Not tolerate it. Not merely accept it because the Constitution says so. Believe in it. That is the quieter work of monarchy. The part that does not fit neatly inside a ceremony program. The part done through school choices. Photographs. Oaths. Uniforms. Carefully timed appearances. Until the palace decides childhood has served its purpose.
Leonor was born into a role before she could understand the word role. That sounds obvious, perhaps.
A princess is born inside a script. But a future queen is something else. A future queen must become public property slowly enough to seem protected, and visibly enough to seem prepared. She must look human, but not ordinary, young, but not careless, modern, but not free in the way ordinary young people are free. There is the first cost. The world sees privilege. The palace sees inventory. I do not say that with cruelty. In fact, cruelty would be too simple. A palace rarely needs to be cruel in the loud way people imagine. It can be gentle, It can be proud. It can surround a child with tutors, protocol, security, speeches, photographs, and affection that may even be sincere. But it still measures. It measures posture. It measures timing. It measures whether a smile looks natural enough to comfort the public, but controlled enough to reassure the institution. And when that child becomes the face of continuity, every gesture begins to carry more weight than a gesture should. A hand raised at the right moment. Uniforme vestido na idade certa. Uma sentença proferida perante o parlamento. Uma medalha colocada no peito. Dia. The public calls it destiny. But destiny is often paperwork with better lighting. That is why the San Javier ceremony matters. Not because it was the whole story, but because it allowed the public to see the result before seeing the machinery. A young woman in uniform, a father beside her, a nation watching, a crown quietly saying, "The future is already under control." And my dear friend, when a palace says the future is under control, I always ask the same question. Whose future? The child's? The family's? The institution's? Because those three things are not the same. They may stand in the same room. They may even smile for the same photograph. But they do not always want the same life. That is the central file on this table. Leonor is not the first young woman asked to carry more than her own name. She is not the first heir turned into a message. She is not the first girl placed between a family's past and a nation's appetite for stability. The crown has done this before, with different fabrics, different prayers, different portraits, different enemies outside the gates. But the pattern is old. When a royal house feels the ground shift beneath it, it often reaches for a young woman who can make the future look clean again. Sometimes she is called chosen, sometimes dutiful, sometimes pure, sometimes modern. The word changes, the function does not. So we begin here, with the house itself, with its need for continuity, with its fear of appearing unnecessary, with its talent for turning private lives into public reassurance. And if the ceremony in 2026 looked complete, that is because the blueprint was already on paper. That is the part I want you to hold in your hand for a moment. Because a palace loves the appearance of inevitability. It prefers the public to believe that ceremonies rise naturally, like music swelling in a hall. The daughter grows older. The uniform appears. The medal is given. The cameras click. Everyone nods as if the whole thing simply unfolded. It did not. In March of 23, the Spanish state put the path into writing. A royal decree created a specific military route for the princess, not a vague family expectation. Not a charming tradition mentioned over dinner. A regulated course, shaped around her condition as heir to the crown, and around the role she may one day hold as head of the armed forces. That matters. Paper matters. I have seen families pretend paper is boring. It is never boring inside a palace. A signed page can move a child from privacy into duty. A stamped line can turn education into theater. A decree can make the future look less like a question and more like an appointment already entered into the household calendar. This decree described 3 successive years. First, land, then sea, then air. Zaragoza for the army, Marin for the Navy, with the old training ship carrying more than cadets across the water. San Javier for the Air Force, where the story would return to the sky, the uniform, and the cross we saw at the beginning. Do you see the elegance of it? The sequence almost writes its own mythology. The air touches the ground. Then the air crosses the sea. Then the air rises into the air. A nation does not need to be told what that means. It feels it. Earth, ocean, sky. Territory, tradition, modernity. The whole kingdom turned into a training route. And this is where the careful viewer begins to understand the ceremony in 2026 differently. That medal did not fall from the ceiling because the public liked a photograph. The decree had already allowed for the great military crosses to be granted by royal decree. Military, naval, aeronautical. 3 branches, 3 symbols, 3 ways of saying the same thing. She belongs to the institution before she belongs to the image. Now, let me be careful. This does not mean the young princess was pretending. It does not mean discipline was fake. It does not mean the training was meaningless. Real training can exist inside political theater. In fact, the strongest theater often uses real discipline, because real discipline photographs better than costume. That is the uncomfortable part. A uniform has weight. So does a role. And when the two are stitched together, the public sees service. The palace sees legitimacy. There is also a family echo here. The official explanation connected her 3-year formation to the experience of the king before her. That is a beautiful phrase if you leave it alone. Like the father, then the daughter. Continuity with boots polished and dates arranged. But nothing in a palace is only family. A father's path becomes precedent. Precedent becomes expectation. Expectation becomes proof. And proof is what a monarchy needs when people begin asking whether old institutions still deserve new loyalty. So before Leonor stood at San Javier, before that cross touched her uniform, before the cameras gave Spain the picture it needed, the house had already done what houses do best. It wrote the rules. It arranged the rooms. It placed the future on a schedule. And once a palace places the future on a schedule, the next question is not whether the child will be watched. The next question is what kind of woman the watching is meant to produce. For that, we have to leave the Air Academy for a while. We go backward, not a few years, centuries, because the Spanish crown has an old memory, and old houses rarely invent their habits from nothing. They inherit them. They polish them. They give them new uniforms. One of the older files belongs to Isabel of Castile. Use the full name once. Then look at the mechanism. Isabel was not born into a simple path. There was a king. There was a disputed succession. There was a rival claim. There were nobles measuring which side might feed them better. And, as always, there was a young woman whose body, marriage, reputation, and obedience became matters of state. At royal weddings, my dear friend, listen less to the vows and more to the seating chart. A marriage can be a love story. In a palace, it is usually also a map. Who sits beside whom? Which family gains a border? Which faction gains a future? Which child, not yet born, will one day be used as proof that the arrangement was always holy, natural, and inevitable? Isabel's marriage to Ferdinand did not merely join two people. It joined political possibilities. It helped create an image of unity strong enough to outlive the private bargain that made it possible. An image mattered because her claim needed to be made believable. That is what the public often misses. Power does not only need force, it needs explanation. It needs a story clean enough to repeat at dinner, in church, on coins, in portraits, in official memory. A woman with a contested path must not look contested. She must look chosen. So the court works. It dresses ambition as virtue. It turns discipline into destiny. It presents a political solution as moral restoration. In Isabel's case, the message became almost sacred. A queen who could clean disorder, unite a realm, and stand beside a husband without disappearing behind him. Even the symbols worked for the argument. Faces on coins, shared authority, the language of balance, the suggestion that heaven itself had approved the arrangement. I admire the efficiency of it. I do not trust it, because when a palace calls a woman pure, I always ask what impurity she is being used to cover. And this is where Isabel's file speaks to the modern one. The details are different, of course. We are not in the same century. We are not in the same monarchy. We are not looking at the same kind of power. But the pattern breathes. A house faces turbulence. A woman becomes the answer. Her discipline is displayed. Her image is cleaned. Her future is made useful before it is fully her own. That is not an accident. That is a method. And once you see it in an older queen, the modern ceremony begins to look less modern than it first appeared. The uniform changes. The camera replaces the coin. The constitutional language replaces the sacred language. But the old question survives. How do you make the public believe that this woman is not merely next in line, but necessary? For Isabel, marriage helped answer that question. But marriage always leaves something behind. A child, a line, an heir. And in a palace, the heir does not inherit only a name. The heir inherits the pressure that made the name useful. Pressure, inside a royal house, begins early. Long before a crown touches a head. The room begins to behave differently around the child who may one day wear it. Adults soften their voices. Cameras are kept at a careful distance, then invited closer at the correct hour. Teachers educate. Protocol trains. Family affection remains, perhaps, but it is never alone in the room. There is always another presence. The institution. A royal child is praised before being known. That is not affection. That is inventory. For Leonor, the pressure became public in stages. First as distance, then as appearance, then as duty. For years, the palace protected the image of childhood. That protection had a purpose. A child hidden too much becomes abstract. A child exposed too much becomes ordinary. So the court must perform a delicate trick. Keep her unseen enough to preserve dignity, but visible enough to train recognition. Then came the age of 18. That birthday was not just private time passing. It was a constitutional threshold. On October 31st, 2023, the young heir swore loyalty to the Constitution before the Spanish Parliament. Listen to the room in that sentence. Not a school hall, not a family chapel. Parliament. The private daughter stepped into the public machinery of the state, and the machinery answered by giving her a place inside its future. That is how monarchies make adulthood different. For most young people, turning 18 means more freedom. For an heir, it can mean less. more signatures, more cameras, more sentences that cannot be spoken casually, because every sentence may become evidence of preparation. There is another detail here, and it is not decorative. Under Spain's succession rules, the old preference for male heirs still remains in the architecture. That means the princess is first in line. A young woman is asked to embody the future of the crown, inside a system that still preserves the shadow of male preference. That is the kind of contradiction palaces learn to cover with ceremony. They do not always remove the old rule. Sometimes they teach a young woman to stand so beautifully in front of it that the public stops looking behind her. And this is why the oath matters. The oath did not make her powerful in the ordinary political sense. She does not govern. She does not command policy. She does not rule Spain from some private desk behind velvet curtains. No. Her power, for now, is symbolic. But symbols are not weak. A symbol can calm a nervous institution. A symbol can soften an old scandal. A symbol can make continuity feel young again. And when a young woman becomes that symbol, her life begins to split. There is the person, and there is the proof. The person grows, studies, laughs, worries, and perhaps dreams of ordinary things we will never see. The proof stands straight. Proof signs books. The proof wears the correct expression beside flags, officers, parents, and cameras. The institution looks uncertain through her. That is a cruel arrangement precisely because it can look so graceful. A father smiles. A daughter swears. The chamber applauds. The country watches. And beneath all of it, the old bargain tightens. We will give you a future, child, but first you must become ours. That is what the heir carries. Not only a name, not only a title, a pressure polished until it resembles honor. And once that pressure becomes visible, the palace must dress it in something the public can understand at a glance. Not a crown, not yet. A uniform. That choice is doing more work than it seems. A crown would make the story too old, too obvious, too decorative. A crown belongs to fairy tales. Coronations, oil portraits, glass cases, and tourists leaning over velvet ropes. A uniform does something else. It speaks the language of service, discipline, sacrifice, state. It tells the public, do not look at this young woman as a sheltered ornament. Look at her as someone being trained to carry duty. That is the genius of the image, and also the danger of it. Because once duty becomes beautiful, people stop asking how much freedom it has consumed. The palace understands clothing better than almost any institution on earth. It always has. Pearls, mantles, mourning black, wedding white, military gold, gloves, medals, sashes. These things do not merely decorate the body. They translate the body. They tell the crowd what to feel before the mind has time to object. A uniform can make a young heir look disciplined before she has had to make any historical decision. A medal can make preparation look complete. A photograph can make continuity feel settled. And in 2026, the Spanish state did something even more revealing than stage the uniform. It minted it. A commemorative coin was issued, with the princess shown in the uniform of the Air Force. Pense nisso por momento. Não apenas fotografado. Não apenas elogiado. Not just placed on a platform while cameras gathered. Pressed into metal. That is not a small gesture. Coins are old instruments of authority. They travel. They last. They carry faces into pockets, collections, archives, drawers, museums. A coin says, "This image belongs to the public record now." The palace did not merely show the future. It gave the future an object. I have handled silver long enough to know that metal remembers what paper forgets. E esta não foi a única imagem. Havia o mar, com o navio escola transformando de formação em viagem. There was the air, with the flight beside her father shortly before the end of her final academy year. There was the parachute course, the diploma, the military rhythm, the repeated message of training made visible. Each piece said something slightly different. The ship said tradition. The flight said transmission. The parachute said courage. The academy said discipline. The coin said permanence. And together, they formed a gallery. Not a gallery of childhood, a gallery of readiness. This is what I mean when I say ceremony is not decoration. Ceremony is obedience wearing perfume. The public sees a young woman moving through institutions. The palace sees institutions moving through a young woman. And that is why the uniform matters more than the fabric. It turns the air into a screen where the nation can project words it badly wants to believe. Stable, paired, clean, modern, useful. But here is the small crack in the gold. The more perfect the image becomes, the more we should ask, what made perfection necessary? Palaces do not spend this much care on symbols when symbols are safe. They spend this much care when the house needs the symbol to hold. So by the time the princess stands in San Javier, the visual argument is almost complete. The decree has written the road. The oath has opened the constitutional door. The uniform has translated the child into service. The coin has fixed the image into metal. Everything shines. And when everything shines, I start looking for the stain. When everything shines, I start looking for the stain. And in this story, the stain is not hidden in the young princess. That is important. The burden she carries did not begin with her. It was waiting before she stepped into the uniform, before the oath, before the coin, before the careful photographs of duty and composure. It was waiting in the older rooms of the house. The Spanish monarchy did not arrive at this moment untouched. No royal house does. But the previous decade had left marks that were difficult to polish away. Public controversies, financial scandals, the shadow of the former king, the uncomfortable sense that the crown, which was supposed to stand above ordinary appetite, had been dragged into the same old questions: money, privilege, secrecy, and trust. A palace can survive a scandal. What it cannot always survive is a scandal people understand. That is the dangerous kind. Not the distant medieval scandal that feels like costume. Not the romantic scandal that can be softened into drama. A modern scandal is colder. It comes with documents, interviews, legal language, bank accounts, headlines, timelines. It does not stay in the ballroom. It enters the phone in someone's hand while they are standing in a supermarket line. That changes the monarchy's problem. The crown no longer has to impress only courtiers, diplomats, bishops, generals, and foreign houses. It has to answer the quiet citizen who looks at the news and thinks, "Why are we still paying for this?" That question is lethal because it is simple, and old institutions fear simple questions. The reign that followed had to repair more than etiquette. It had to repair trust. There were gestures toward transparency, distance from the old controversies, a cleaner public language, a harder line between the institution and the scandals attached to the past. But repairs need a face. That is where the young heir becomes more than a daughter. She becomes reassurance, not because she caused the wound, because she can be made to stand where the wound is most visible. Look again at the images now. The uniform is not just service, it is repair. The oath is not just constitutional duty, it is reassurance. The coin is not just commemoration. It is a small metal argument that the future is orderly, disciplined, and worthy of being kept. And once you understand that, the word training begins to feel too small. This is not only training. This is reputational architecture. A house damaged by age, scandal, and public fatigue begins to build a younger room at the front of the palace. Better lit, better controlled, easier to trust. The old room remains behind it. Do not forget that. A monarchy does not erase its past by placing a young woman in the light. It only asks the public to look at her long enough for the shadows to blur. That is why I resist the easy story of the perfect princess. Perfection is not a personality, it is a job. And for a royal house trying to steady itself, perfection becomes useful precisely because it asks so little from the audience. No complicated defense. No old explanations. Just a clear image. A young woman. A uniform. A promise that the next chapter will behave better than the last. It is a beautiful promise. It may even be sincere. But sincerity does not make it harmless. Because when a child becomes the answer to an institution's wound, the weight of the past settles upon them. The child inherits the wound without being allowed to name it. There is the mini-climax of this first file. The scandal did not simply damage the old crown. It gave the new image a job. And once an image has a job, my dear friend, it rarely belongs to the person wearing it. Before I open the older files, let me place one beside them. Because what we are tracing here is not only a story about one princess, one uniform, or one monarchy trying to look steady after damage. It is a pattern. And patterns deserve a dossier. That is why I keep The Shadow of the Throne. A psychological dossier on the true cost of the crown. It is a separate file on the machinery behind royal power. Isolation, public image, family pressure, paranoia, silence, and the strange emotional cost of being born close to a throne. This episode will show you how a young heir can become the face of institutional repair. But the dossier goes deeper into what the crown does to the mind once the doors close. If you want that file, you will find it in the first line of the description and in the pinned comment. Now, let us return to the older rooms. Because once you understand the wound, the next file becomes much easier to read. When a dynasty is afraid, it rarely becomes honest. It becomes more careful. That is the older rule. And if we want to understand the modern image of a young heir shaped by uniform, oath, and ceremony, we should look at two older rooms where fear learned to dress itself beautifully. The first belongs to Elizabeth, not the grandmother of television memory. The earlier one. The queen who had to turn vulnerability into theater before her enemies turned it into a weapon. Elizabeth had a problem every palace understood at once. She was a woman on a throne in a kingdom still arguing with itself over faith, legitimacy, marriage, and succession, and foreign threat. She could not simply be powerful. She had to make power look natural on a body many men had been trained to consider politically incomplete. So the court doubled down, not only with armies, with image, portraits, pearls, symbols. Chastity turned into policy. Solitude turned into sovereignty. A body that could have been treated as a weakness became a sacred surface. And here, if this were a dramatized scene, not a quotation, only a voice imagined from that palace, it might sound like this: "Do not let them see a woman alone. Let them see a kingdom untouched." That is the trick. The court did not erase the vulnerability. It framed it so carefully that the public learned to call it strength. A queen unmarried became not a woman without a husband, but a woman married to the realm. A face on a portrait became not vanity, but command. A hand resting near a globe could tell a story before a council ever opened its mouth. This was not decoration, it was defense. Elizabeth understood something many rulers learned too late. If people are going to look at you, teach them what they are seeing. Now move to another room. Smaller, more domestic, more suffocating. Victoria. Before she became the image of an era, she was a girl, managed by a system built around control. The childhood often remembered around her was not a nursery full of ordinary freedom. It was supervision, restriction, careful reading, careful movement, the old Kensington machinery, designed to keep the future queen close, dependent, and available to those who wished to govern through her. The cage did not need iron bars. It had schedules, rooms, manners, adults. A girl does not have to be imprisoned to be contained. Sometimes she only has to be told, every day, that the house knows best. And then comes the twist that palaces never quite control. The child grows. The symbol develops a will. Victoria became queen at 18, and the very image of purity and disciplined domestic virtue that had been pressed around her could be turned into a new public language for monarchy. The system tried to make her manageable. She used part of what it gave her to make the crown respectable again. That is why these older files matter. They do not say that every princess lives the same life. They do not say that every training is abuse, or every ceremony a lie. That would be too easy. What they show is sharper. When a royal house senses danger, it often does not release the woman at the center. It refines her. It turns her restraint into proof. It turns her watched life into reassurance. It calls the pressure virtue. And if the woman is clever, stubborn, lucky, or ruthless enough, she may learn to use the image back. That is the part I never want to flatten. These women were not only victims of the stage. Some became extraordinary performers on it. But even a brilliant performer does not own the theater. The palace keeps the doors. The palace sells the tickets. The palace decides when the lights go up. And this brings us back to the young heir in uniform. The modern house is not copying those old queens scene by scene. History is rarely that tidy, but it is using the same instinct. When trust is fragile, make the symbol steadier. When the future is doubted, choreograph it. When the institution looks old, place youth at the front. The house doubles down, not always because it is wicked, often because it is afraid. And fear, in a palace, has excellent posture. But posture cannot hold forever if the world outside the gates has changed. And it has. That is the problem every modern monarchy faces. The old court could survive behind distance. A rumor might take weeks to travel. A portrait could be controlled. A ceremony could be described by friendly pens. A scandal could be muffled by servants, lawyers, relatives, and time. Not anymore. Now the palace competes with a phone screen, a clipped video, a headline, a photograph taken from the wrong angle, a tax debate, a citizen who does not hate monarchy exactly, but wants to know what it is for. That question is newer than the crown would like to admit. What is it for? In an absolute monarchy, the answer was power. In a sacred monarchy, the answer was God. In an imperial monarchy, the answer was conquest, lineage, glory, and fear. But in a parliamentary monarchy, the answer becomes more delicate. The crown must be above politics, but not useless. Visible, but not vulgar. Traditional, but not fossilized. Expensive, but somehow worth the cost. That is a narrow corridor. I would not care to carry a tray through it. This is why training becomes performance. Not fake performance. Public performance. The monarchy must show that its heirs are not merely waiting. They are preparing. They are studying. They are serving. They are becoming fluent in the rituals of a state that no longer gives them direct political power, but still asks them to embody continuity. Other European heirs have walked versions of this corridor. A British heir trained with the military, studied, served, and entered duties gradually. A Belgian heir moved through international education and military discipline, then into elite universities. A Swedish heir grew through a long public apprenticeship and has now reached maturity, with military formation woven into a broader life of representation. So the uniform is not uniquely Spanish. That would be the wrong lesson. The Spanish case is sharper because of concentration. 3 years, 3 branches, a constitutional oath, a visible military arc with a beginning, middle, and public culmination. It is not simply preparation. It is preparation arranged as a story. That story matters because the monarchy no longer survives by commanding obedience. It survives by persuading people that obedience is not the word. Respect, perhaps. Continuity. Service. Stability. A feeling that the institution still performs a useful emotional function for the state. A crown today must be believed before it is obeyed, and belief has to be renewed, again and again. This is where the court can become trapped by its own solution. The more it performs usefulness, the more the public learns to judge the performance. Was the gesture sincere? Was the training meaningful? Was the image too polished? Was the young heir protected or produced? No palace enjoys that last question, because it moves the conversation from the symbol to the machinery. And machinery is never as beautiful as ceremony. Look at the public reading of Leonor's appearances. Military events become signs of future command. A family presence becomes continuity. Sobriety becomes maturity. Every controlled moment becomes evidence that the future is safe in careful hands. That is useful. It may even be necessary, but it creates a risk. If every appearance is interpreted as proof, then every absence becomes a question. Every tired expression becomes a headline. Every mistake becomes more than a mistake. A young woman cannot simply be young. She becomes a national weather report. Calm, clouded, promising, uncertain. This is the burden modern courts rarely confess. The world changed, so the palace learned new instruments, press offices, official videos, carefully released photographs, education arcs, military arcs, coins, ceremonies designed for television and replayed on small screens. But the instinct underneath is old. Control the image before the image controls you. And there, my dear friend, is the trap. The more a house controls the image, the more fragile the human being inside the image can become. Closed doors are useful. They are not walls against history. And the next pressure does not come from journalists, parliaments, or foreign courts. It comes from inside the bloodline itself. A dynasty likes to pretend that blood simplifies everything. It does not. Blood can open a door. It can also turn the corridor into a battlefield. This is the part of monarchy that ceremony tries to soften. The family is presented as continuity, affection, inheritance, duty. Portraits on walls, children beside parents, names repeated across generations until the house begins to sound eternal. But inside that beautiful language, blood is never only family. Blood is a claim. Blood is a weapon. Blood is the reason people bow, and the reason other people refuse to bow. Maria Theresa of Austria learned that lesson in the most expensive way. Her father had tried to protect the succession before the crisis came. The pragmatic sanction was supposed to make the inheritance possible, to persuade Europe that his daughter could inherit the Habsburg lands. On paper, the house had prepared an answer. But a law is not the same as obedience. And a signature is not the same as fear. When the old emperor died, there were no tears. The question did not politely disappear because documents existed. It sharpened. Powers that had accepted the arrangement began to test it. Rival claims appeared. Opportunists smelled weakness. A young woman inherited not only lands, titles, and a family name, but a continent willing to ask whether her right was strong enough to survive men with armies. This is where the old file becomes useful. Maria Theresa was not simply a woman with royal blood. She was a woman forced to prove that royal blood still counted when it ran through her. And here, if we imagine the room as a dramatized historical scene, not a quotation and not a transcript, it would not need much dialogue. Just a table, a map, wax seals, letters arriving too quickly, courtiers trying to hide what they already know. The father had spent years defending the daughter's right to inherit, but the storm waited until the daughter was alone. That is the cruelty of dynastic preparation. A house can spend decades arranging the rules and still fail to prepare the person for the moment when everyone tests the rule at once. Maria Theresa survived, but survival did not mean softness. She became a ruler under pressure, a mother of many children, a symbol of continuity, and a political body expected to reproduce the future while defending the present. The womb and the throne were not separate in that world. They were part of the same machine. That is why the comparison with Leonor is not direct, but revealing. Spain is not 18th century Austria. A modern constitutional monarchy does not ask a princess to secure the state by bearing 16 children, posing as martial motherhood, or fighting a continental succession war. History does not repeat that neatly. But the old anxiety survives in a cleaner form. Do not let the heir look improvised. Do not let the bloodline seem fragile. Do not let anyone believe the house forgot to prepare the woman who may carry it next. That is why training matters. Not because a uniform solves succession, because it tells the public that succession has been rehearsed. Then comes Catherine, and she breaks the pattern. She is useful here precisely because she was not the simple heir molded from birth to receive a native crown. She was born a German princess, entered Russia through marriage, learned the language, converted, adapted, watched, calculated, and then did something far more dangerous than inheriting a role. She made herself into the role. If Maria Theresa shows the danger of blood that others contest, she would do the same. Catherine shows the danger of blood that is not enough. She had to manufacture belonging. She had to become more convincing than the people who were supposed to be more natural. And once power was in her hands, image became an empire of its own. Education, reform language, correspondence with philosophers, architecture, portraits, ceremonies, victories. The performance of enlightenment wrapped around absolute power. This was not childhood training. It was adult self-invention. The palace did not simply build her. She learned how to build the palace around herself. That is a different kind of monarchy, but it exposes the same secret. Crowns are never carried by blood alone. They are carried by story, by recognition, by the ability to make people accept that this person, and not another person, belongs at the center of the room. So when we return to the young Spanish heir, the question becomes sharper. What is the palace really protecting? The girl? The law? The dynasty? The image of a future that must not look uncertain. Leonor's position rests on law, family, education, and public ritual. But it also rests on a delicate emotional contract. The country has to look at her and believe that continuity can pass through her without cracking. That belief is not automatic. It is cultivated. It is staged. It is repeated until it feels natural. And this is why Blood Against Blood is not only about old wars, rival claimants, or forgotten princes with better armies. Sometimes the conflict is quieter. A daughter against the son the law once would have preferred. A young heir against the scandals of older men. A future queen against every memory that says female power must first prove itself useful, disciplined, controlled, and safe. That is the hidden pressure in the family line. The house does not merely hand her a crown. It hands her a problem that blood created, and then asks her to look like the solution. Collapse is easy to recognize when it arrives loudly. A throne falls. A family flees. A palace gate opens to a crowd that no longer believes in the old magic. But monarchies do not always collapse in dramatic scenes. Sometimes they survive. And survival can be harder to see clearly because it dresses itself as maturity, reform, transparency, modernization, service. The words are reasonable. Some of the changes may even be necessary. A royal house that cannot adapt becomes a museum with security guards. A crown that cannot explain itself becomes a costume with public funding. So the institution changes. It speaks more carefully. It releases cleaner images. It gives the public a more disciplined air. It turns preparation into proof. This is not the same as saying the image is false. That would be too simple and too lazy. The training can be real. The service can be real. The pressure can be real. The young woman inside the institution can be intelligent, dutiful, serious, and sincere. That is precisely what makes the machine more powerful. It does not need to invent everything. It only needs to arrange what is real into a story the public can trust. This is the survival strategy. Not command. Not sacred distance. Not imperial fear. Competence. Competence performed so steadily that the monarchy begins to look less like an inheritance and more like a public service with antique architecture. That is the modern crown's most delicate trick. It must be ordinary enough to survive scrutiny, but extraordinary enough to justify itself. It must look accessible, but not common, human, but not messy, traditional, but not trapped, young, but not reckless, female, but not threatening, prepared, but not manufactured. Every word in that list pulls in a different direction, and the person at the center feels the pull. This is where survival becomes deformation. The crown survives by asking her to become a shape that solves too many problems at once. She must be a daughter, but also continuity, a student, but also discipline, a soldier in training, but also a national promise, a young woman, but also evidence that the old house has learned something from the past. And if the public likes the image, the palace receives a reward: more trust, more patience, more time. But if the public starts asking what the image costs, the same strategy becomes dangerous. Because then the question changes. Not this, is the princess prepared? But this, prepared for whom? For the state? For the family? For the monarchy's future? For a public that wants reassurance more than it wants honesty? This is why the story cannot end at the medal in San Javier. The medal is not the conclusion. It is a visible sign of the bargain. The palace offers a trained future. The public offers conditional belief. And the heir stands where those two needs meet. That place can look glorious from a distance. Up close, it is narrower. A constitutional monarchy does not usually ask its heir to rule with personal power. It asks her to embody a power that has been limited, translated, ritualized, and turned into feeling. Unity, permanence, continuity, stability. Beautiful words, heavy words, words that become heavier when they are placed on one living body. So no, the Spanish crown is not staging the same drama as Austria, Russia, England, or Castile. It is not fighting the same wars. It is not using the same weapons. But it is solving the same ancient problem in modern clothes. How does a house convince people that its future is necessary? It shows them a person who looks ready to carry it. And that is the danger. Because the more ready she looks, the easier it becomes to forget that readiness was built around her. Not simply discovered. Built, timed, photographed, regulated, repeated. The institution survives by making the construction look natural. And once you see that, the old pattern becomes difficult to unsee. The pattern is not that royal women are weak. That is the lazy reading. The pattern is that royal houses often become most interested in women when the future needs to be made believable, when legitimacy is contested, when scandal has damaged the old language, when a dynasty needs virtue, youth, discipline, motherhood, purity, sacrifice, or renewal to appear in human form. Then the daughter becomes useful. The princess becomes an answer. The queen becomes a mirror held up to the house so the public can see something cleaner than the machinery behind it. This is why the story of Leonor cannot be reduced to privilege, and it cannot be reduced to victimhood either. Both versions are too small. Privilege is real, constraint is real, training is real, performance is real. The difficult truth is that all of them can exist in the same body. A princess can live inside luxury and still be narrowed by duty. She can receive honors and still be used as evidence. She can be sincere and still be positioned. She can prepare for a constitutional role and still become the emotional repair. Project of a damaged institution. That is the part worth watching. Not the fairy tale, not the uniform alone, not the medal alone. The transaction. The exchange between the house and the person who carries its future. The house gives her a name, a place, a history, a language of duty, and a path that looks meaningful because it has been prepared before she was old enough to choose it. In return, she gives the house something it desperately needs: a face the public can trust. A future that does not look tired. A way to speak about continuity without forcing everyone to stare too long at the past. That exchange is the hidden architecture of the crown. It was there when marriage turned a princess into strategy. It was there when portraits turned a queen into legitimacy. It was there when isolation was called protection. It was there when motherhood became statecraft. It was there when a foreign-born woman learned to manufacture belonging until an empire accepted her as inevitable. And it is there now, in cleaner language, under brighter cameras with constitutional words instead of divine ones. The old world has changed. The old hunger has not. A monarchy still needs the future to look natural. It still needs the public to believe that inheritance can become service. It still needs a young person to stand in front of history and make the line appear unbroken. That is why the question from the beginning matters. Was the ceremony in San Javier simply a proud family moment? Yes, perhaps. But not only that. Was it military training? Yes. But not only that either. It was a house showing the country that its next chapter had been disciplined into shape. And maybe that is the most elegant form of obedience a modern monarchy can create. Not the obedience of kneeling. The obedience of becoming convincing. The obedience of carrying a role so gracefully that people stop asking who designed it. So when we look at the princess in uniform, we are not just looking at a young woman preparing for a possible throne. We are looking at a system that learned, over centuries, how to place women at the exact point where blood, image, crisis, and hope meet. That is the real archive. Not one crown, not one family, not one photograph from July 2026. A pattern. And patterns, my dear friend, are where palaces usually hide their confessions. If this archive stayed with you, keep a place for it. Subscribe, because we are not finished with these houses. There are more daughters turned into answers, more sons protected by silence, more crowns polished so brightly that the scratches become harder to see. And tell me in the comments what you saw here. Was this duty? Was it survival? Or was it a golden cage, dressed carefully enough to look like destiny? I read those comments, because sometimes the sharpest part of the archive is what you notice after the doors close. And if you want to go deeper into the private cost of living near the throne, the dossier I mentioned earlier is waiting for you. The Shadow of the Throne. For now, my dear friend, leave the light low. The palace looks different when you stop staring at the crown. I am Elijah, and I will meet you in the next file.